I got arrested for a minor traffic violation, but when the officer realized I was innocent, his apology and how he handled it completely changed my view on law enforcement. I never thought a simple traffic stop would turn into something that would completely alter my perspective on law enforcement. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when it happened. The roads were slick, and the kind of darkness that only a storm could bring had settled in. I had just finished work and was heading home, ready to relax after a long day. I wasn't speeding or doing anything out of the ordinary, just trying to get home like everyone else. But the flashing lights in my rearview mirror pulled me out of my thoughts and into a state of confusion. I glanced over to the side of the road, trying to figure out what I could have done wrong. My heart started racing as I pulled over to the shoulder and turned off the engine. The rain was hitting the windshield like tiny pellets, making the world outside blur. As I sat there, waiting for the officer, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake without realizing it. A few moments later, the officer approached my car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black rain jacket. The steady rhythm of raindrops on the roof of my car made it feel like we were in a vacuum, where nothing else existed but the two of us. He knocked on the window, and I rolled it down. His breath misted in the cold air, his voice deep and deliberate as he asked for my license and registration. I handed them over, trying to maintain my composure, but my mind was racing. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked. I shook my head, genuinely confused. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding or anything." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the documents I had given him, his eyes scanning over the information. The silence stretched for a beat too long, and then he spoke again, his tone more serious. "Your headlights weren't on." I blinked, a wave of relief mixed with disbelief hitting me. "What?" "My headlights were on when I left the office." He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from the papers back to me. "Your front lights are off, ma'am. I checked your vehicle's plate and your registration, and it's all coming up clean, but the lights aren't working right now." Something didn't sit right with me. I had made sure to check everything before leaving, and I always made sure my headlights were functioning. Was he mistaken? Or was there something more going on here? I tried to explain that I had checked everything before leaving the office, but he wasn't having it. He was already jotting something down on his ticket pad, the pen moving across the paper in quick strokes. "You'll need to come with me," he said, his voice flat. Confusion flooded my mind. I hadn't expected to be taken in for something so minor. A ticket, maybe, but not this. It was as if the officer wasn't going to give me a chance to explain myself any further. I got out of the car slowly, watching him carefully as he approached me. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, though I could tell he wasn't trying to be threatening. It was the standard protocol, I assumed. Still, it made the situation feel far more serious than it was. He led me to the back of his patrol car, where another officer was standing. I could hear the soft hum of the rain on the street, the sound of cars driving past, but everything felt distant. The officer I had been speaking to was now talking to the other one. A few quiet words exchanged, but I couldn't catch what they were saying. Then, just as quickly as the tension had escalated, it started to ease. The officer who had originally stopped me leaned back against his patrol car, his eyes narrowing in concentration. He walked back toward me, his face looking different, almost like he had just realized something important. "Hey, look," he started, his voice softer now. "It seems like I made a mistake." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "Your headlights," he said. "They're not the issue. I just checked the wrong thing." He paused and let out a breath, clearly embarrassed. "Your car's automatic headlights weren't on because the rain sensors weren't picking up the storm. They only trigger when the rain hits a certain intensity. I should have double-checked." "I'm sorry." For a second, I was stunned into silence. The tension that had been so thick just moments ago now felt completely ridiculous. The officer was apologizing, but it felt genuine. He wasn't brushing it off or dismissing my concerns. He was actually admitting to a mistake. "I'm sorry for the confusion," he added, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I should have been more thorough before pulling you over." I stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. It didn't make sense. A simple mistake over something so small, yet here we were. And yet, the way the officer was handling it made a difference. He could have easily written me up for the ticket and moved on, but he didn't. Instead, he was owning up to the mistake, a level of accountability I wasn't expecting. Before I could say anything else, he added, "I'll go ahead and let you off with a warning. Get your lights checked out, though. I'd hate to see something happen if they don't work when you need them." I nodded, still a bit in shock, and watched as the officer stepped away, leaving me standing by my car in the rain. The whole encounter had been so strange, and I felt both confused and oddly grateful. It had been such a minor violation, yet it had led to something much deeper than I had anticipated. As I drove home, the rain still pouring down, I couldn't stop thinking about how different this experience had been from the stories I'd heard. Most people talk about police encounters as if they're always filled with tension, anger, or even fear. But this had been different. It wasn't the way I'd expected to see a police officer, but it had changed something in me, something I didn't even realize I needed to change. The drive home felt surreal. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, and the dim streetlights reflected off the puddles, casting long shadows. My car hummed along the road, but my mind was somewhere else, replaying the whole encounter over and over. I kept thinking about the officer's apology. It wasn't just about the mistake, it was about how he handled it. Most of the time, when people get pulled over, the last thing they expect is for the officer to admit they were wrong. It wasn't something I'd ever really thought about before, but that moment felt different. He didn't brush me off or act like I was just a nuisance. He didn't try to justify his mistake with excuses. He was honest. I had never experienced a situation like that with law enforcement before. I got home, parked my car, and walked inside. My partner was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, a half-drunk cup of coffee in front of them. They looked up when I walked in, eyebrows raised in question. "You okay?" they asked. "Yeah," I said, shaking my head. "Just a weird day." I told them about the traffic stop, the officer, and the apology. As I spoke, I noticed that they didn't seem as surprised by the story as I expected. Instead, they just listened, nodding along. "That's actually pretty rare," they said once I finished. "Most people don't get an apology when the cops mess up." I agreed. It was rare, but that didn't change the fact that it had left me with a strange feeling. I kept wondering what it was about that moment that made such an impact on me. Was it the officer's willingness to admit fault? Was it the fact that I had been treated with respect instead of judgment? I didn't have answers yet. All I knew was that I wasn't the same person I had been earlier that day, and I didn't know how to process that change. The next morning, I decided to take the officer's advice. I called up a mechanic to check the headlights. They confirmed the issue with the rain sensors, just like the officer had explained, and gave me a quick fix. It wasn't anything major, just a minor tweak that had to be done. Still, it made me think about how something so small could have caused such a big ripple. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the encounter was about more than just headlights and rain sensors. It had shaken my perception of authority, of law enforcement, in a way I hadn't expected. Most of the time, the narrative around police is negative. Stories about misconduct, abuse of power, and corruption are everywhere. And yet, here was an officer who had done the opposite. I couldn't help but wonder, was he the exception? Or was there something deeper going on? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about a culture that could either encourage accountability or sweep mistakes under the rug. A culture that could either leave people feeling powerless or make them feel like their voice mattered. A few days passed, and I kept thinking about that night. It had started with a simple traffic stop, something that should have been over in a matter of minutes. But it lingered in my mind, pulling me back to it again and again. The officer had been kind, yes, but it wasn't just his kindness that stuck with me. It was his approach, his humanity. I began to notice something in the way people talked about police. It wasn't just about the us versus them mentality. It wasn't always about whether or not the police were doing their job correctly. It was about how the police chose to engage with the community they served. I thought about that officer's apology. How it wasn't just about him admitting he made a mistake. It was about acknowledging that mistakes can happen, and that people, civilians, officers, everyone, are capable of learning from them. That was the moment I realized how much I had taken for granted in the way I viewed law enforcement. My perceptions were shaped by the negative stories, the stereotypes, the headlines I read. It was easy to assume that everyone was the same, that every encounter would go the same way. But that officer showed me that it wasn't always like that. The more I reflected, the more I realized how rare it was for someone in authority to openly admit fault without being defensive or dismissive. Most of the time, power structures, whether in the police, the workplace, or even in family dynamics, tend to protect their own. To admit a mistake often feels like admitting weakness. It's the kind of thing that doesn't happen often enough, no matter where you are. And yet, in that brief encounter, that officer had done the opposite. He had put his ego aside and taken responsibility. Maybe it was a small thing, but it was huge to me. The message it sent was simple, yet powerful. Even those in positions of power can make mistakes, and when they do, they can make things right. That's what stayed with me long after the incident. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was a lesson in humanity, in accountability, in how we all interact with the world around us. And for the first time in a long time, I started to feel like maybe the world wasn't as divided as I had always thought. Maybe there were more good people out there than I had been led to believe. Maybe things could change, not just with the police, but with how we treat each other in general. It was a simple mistake that led to a bigger realization. It was a moment that changed how I saw not just law enforcement, but the world itself. A few weeks had passed since the incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had shifted. The simple traffic stop had opened a door I didn't know existed. I had expected to forget about it eventually, to let it fade into the background like so many other minor inconveniences in life. But this stayed with me. I kept hearing about more and more people who had negative interactions with law enforcement, their voices loud and persistent on social media, news outlets, and within conversations. And for the first time, I found myself understanding both sides of the argument in a way I hadn't before. There was always this deep divide, those who felt they were mistreated and those who stood by the system, believing it was meant to protect. But my experience, it wasn't so black and white. The officer had made a mistake, yes, but instead of letting it escalate, he had taken the time to listen, to assess, and to correct it. There was a kind of humility in that, a sense of responsibility that I hadn't really considered before. One evening, a few days after I'd fixed the headlights, I had the opportunity to reflect on the encounter when I bumped into a friend I hadn't seen in a while. We were catching up over coffee, and the conversation naturally turned to everything happening in the world: the news, the protests, the divisive narratives surrounding law enforcement. My friends shared their thoughts, their anger palpable as they spoke about the injustices they had witnessed and experienced. I listened, but something inside me urged me to speak up. I had to share my story, not because I thought it would fix anything, but because I believed it was a piece of the puzzle that was often missing in these discussions. I get what you're saying. I started, hesitant at first. I really do. But something happened to me recently that's made me think differently about everything. My friend raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? I told them about the traffic stop, the officer, and the apology. I shared how unexpected it had been, how I had felt treated with respect and fairness in a situation that could have easily gone the other way. It wasn't just about the mistake. It was about how the officer had handled it. He had owned it, apologized, and even let me off with a warning. He didn't have to do that. And I was beginning to realize how rare it was for people in positions of power to be that accountable. My friend listened carefully, nodding, but their expression was mixed. Skepticism mingled with curiosity. That sounds like a good cop. Yeah, they said. But that's just one officer. There's a system, a whole structure. That's the problem. I don't think one good interaction changes anything. I nodded, understanding their point. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was important, maybe more important than either of us realized. One good interaction didn't solve everything, but it had shown me that it was possible to see things differently. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for growth and change within the system, as unlikely as that seemed. We didn't argue, but we didn't completely agree either. We just sat there, sipping our coffee, each of us holding on to our own truths. A few days later, I got a call from the police department. It wasn't something I had been expecting, but when I saw the number, my heart skipped a beat. What if something had gone wrong? What if they were reconsidering the warning? I answered, trying to steady my nerves. Hello. I said cautiously. Hello, this is Officer H, from the precinct. I wanted to reach out personally to follow up on the stop you had a few weeks ago. How are you doing? I was taken aback. I hadn't expected a follow-up at all. I'm doing fine, I replied. I'm good, thank you. The officer's voice was warm, friendly even. I just wanted to make sure you weren't still having any issues with your headlights. It's not something we do often, but I try to check in with people when I make a mistake. I was floored. This wasn't just a random courtesy call. This was another example of accountability. Someone actually taking the time to check in and make sure I was okay. No issues at all. I got them fixed, I said, still a little stunned by the personal nature of the call. Honestly, I really appreciate you reaching out. The officer's tone softened, as if he was relieved. I just wanted to make sure everything was squared away. And again, I apologize for the inconvenience. It's not every day I get to have an interaction like that. I hope it gave you some peace of mind. I almost didn't know how to respond. It felt like the entire experience had come full circle. What had started as a minor mistake had now become something more meaningful. As we hung up, I sat there in silence, my mind racing with thoughts. The more I reflected, the more I realized that maybe this kind of accountability was what was missing in a lot of other interactions, both in law enforcement and beyond. People made mistakes. They were human. But it wasn't about the mistake itself. It was about what came next. Did they own it? Did they apologize? Did they try to make things right? In the end, I realized that the officer's actions hadn't just changed my view on law enforcement. They had reminded me that people were capable of change, of doing better. And maybe, just maybe, the real work began with us. How we chose to treat each other, to hold ourselves accountable, and to be better than we were yesterday. I didn't know if that officer's behavior was the norm, but I knew it was something I would carry with me. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It was about understanding that respect, accountability, and humanity were things that could make a difference, one small interaction at a time. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful.